Okay, we have an exercise that will test your ability to use quotation marks correctly. Turn to your study guide, and when you finish the exercise, come back and we'll see how well you did. Now, in these sentences, quotation marks have been omitted, and we've also left out some of the punctuation marks that ought to be included. So you can have the fun of figuring out which punctuation marks belong here and where they ought to go in relation to the quotation marks. So let's go through each of these sentences and see how well you were able to figure that out. First, as Robert Frost remarked in his poem Mending Wall, good fences make good neighbors. Now, there are actually two things in this sentence that need to be enclosed within quotation marks. There's the quotation itself, the words that come from the poem. The quotation is, good fences make good neighbors. So we want to put double quotation marks, normal quotation marks, around that entire sentence. So we'd have opening quotation marks before good and closing quotation marks after neighbors. In addition, the title of the poem, Mending Wall, should also be contained within quotation marks. Remember that titles of poems are one of the kinds of titles that would normally be enclosed within quotation marks. So we'd have quotation marks around Mending Wall. In addition, we do need to add a period at the end of the whole sentence because, after all, sentences need to end with some kind of punctuation mark, and a period would make sense. And the period would go inside the final closing quotation marks, because that's what we do with periods. So the sentence would ultimately be correctly punctuated like this. As Robert Frost remarked in his poem, opening quotation marks, Mending Wall, comma, closing quotation marks, opening quotation marks, good fences make good neighbors, period, closing quotation marks. Let's look at our next example. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words, I hate quotations, tell me what you know? Ralph Waldo Emerson was a famous 19th century writer, and it's ironic that one of the most famous quotations from his work is this statement about hating quotations, but that's the way it is. Now we have to figure out how we're going to punctuate this sentence, and doing so will prove to be a little bit tricky. First, let's figure out where the quotation is. That is, what are the words that Emerson actually said, which should be enclosed in quotation marks? Well, Emerson's words were, I hate quotations, tell me what you know. So we want to put quotation marks around those sentences. So we will have opening quotation marks in front of I and closing quotation marks after the word know. Now, what about the closing punctuation for the entire sentence? What kind of sentence is this? Well, if you think about it, you can see that the sentence is an interrogative sentence. It's asking a question. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words blah, blah, blah? What did he mean? It's asking a question. So we need to end the entire sentence with a question mark. So then we have to figure out, where does the question mark go in relation to the quotation marks? Does it go inside the quotation marks or outside them? Well, if we were dealing with a period or a comma, we would always put it inside the quotation marks. But remember, other punctuation marks go either inside or outside the quotation marks, depending on whether they are part of the quotation itself. Now, did Emerson's quotation contain a question mark? Was Emerson asking a question? I hate quotations, tell me what you know. No, that's a declarative sentence. He is not asking a question. So the question mark is not part of Emerson's quotation. Instead, it's part of the broader sentence. The author of this entire sentence is asking the question. So the question mark should go outside of the closing quotation marks, and the sentence would be correctly punctuated like this. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words, comma, opening quotation marks, I hate quotations, period, tell me what you know, close quotation marks, question mark. The question mark ends the sentence and it goes outside of the quotation marks because it is not part of what Emerson said. Notice, too, that we followed the rule of not doubling up on punctuation marks. Emerson's statement, tell me what you know, is a declarative sentence. It would normally end with a period. However, we don't put in the period because then we'd be doubling up. We'd have a period, closing quotation marks, and then the question mark, and that would look a little weird. So we simply omit the period because we need the question mark instead. We don't double up and put the period as well. Next example. The company president asked all employees to look for ways to work more efficiently and therefore save money. Where do the quotation marks go in this sentence? Well, this is perhaps a trick question. There are no quotation marks in this sentence, and there shouldn't be any. Why? Well, remember what quotation marks are for. Quotation marks are used to set off the words in a direct quotation. That means that when you write a sentence that actually quotes the exact words used by someone else, you enclose those words in quotation marks. This sentence is not a direct quotation. Actually, it's an example of an indirect quotation. Here we are reporting what the company president said. The company president asked all employees to look for ways to work more efficiently and therefore save money. It is a report of something that was said. So in that sense, it's a quotation, but it's an indirect quotation because the exact words are not being reported. If they were, we would have a true quotation, a direct quotation, which would have to be enclosed in quotation marks. So, for example, suppose the sentence read something like this. The company president said, all employees should look for ways to work more efficiently and therefore save money. Now we would be quoting the exact words actually spoken by the company president, and we would enclose those in quotation marks. But as it is, this is not a direct quotation. It's an indirect quotation, and quotation marks are not used for that. So we put a period at the end of the sentence and move on to the next example. Churchill ended his stirring wartime speech with the words, "Let us therefore bear ourselves so that men will say, this was their finest hour." Okay, here's another slightly complicated example. And by the way, for purposes of this exercise, we've slightly shortened the actual quotation from Churchill. So if you ever look up the actual speech, you'll see the words are a little different. But we're organizing it this way just to make the exercise a little clearer and easier. What exactly did Churchill say? Well, the exact words used by Churchill were, "Let us therefore bear ourselves so that men will say, this was their finest hour." Okay, Churchill said that whole thing, so therefore all of those words should be enclosed in quotation marks. So we would have opening quotation marks before the word let and closing quotation marks after the word hour. However, we notice there's something else going on within this quotation. Churchill himself is quoting other words. He is quoting what men in the future might say about the people of today. And what might those men of the future say? They would look back on the people of Churchill's own historical time and say, this was their finest hour. So Churchill is imagining what the words of a future person might be and quoting them within his quotation. So we have here that unusual situation of a quotation within a quotation. So here is where single quotation marks need to be used, and we'll put the single quotation marks around the words, this was their finest hour. And we will also use a comma to separate that quotation from the broader quotation. And finally end the whole thing with a period inside all of the quotation marks, because that's where periods always go. So we've got a quotation within a quotation here, and that's why we'll use both double quotation marks for the bigger quote and single quotation marks for the smaller quote within a quote. The sentence as a whole then will be punctuated like this. Churchill ended his stirring wartime speech with the words, comma, opening double quotation marks. Let us therefore bear ourselves so that men will say, comma, opening single quotation marks, this was their finest hour. Period, closing single quotation marks, closing double quotation marks. You have to look closely to make sure you've set up all the layers of quotation marks correctly. But if you do, then the reader will be able to understand exactly what Churchill said and exactly where Churchill was quoting from the imagined speech of some future person. And therefore the entire structure of this rather complicated quotation will be clear. Final example. Everyone chuckled when Kevin quipped, "Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework?" Okay, we have a quotation here. What exactly did Kevin say? What are the words that should be within the quotation marks? Well, Kevin said, "Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework?" So we want quotation marks around all of that. So we will have opening quotation marks before the word why and closing quotation marks after the word homework. Now, we can also see that a question is involved here. The question is exactly what Kevin said. Kevin is asking a question. Kevin's own statement is an interrogative sentence. Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework? So we're going to need to end this sentence with a question mark to reflect the fact that Kevin is asking a question. But where does the question mark go? Well, remember that the question mark, like other punctuation marks other than period and comma, only goes within the quotation marks when it's actually a part of the quotation. And that is the case here. Kevin's actual quotation is itself a question, and therefore the question mark is part of the quotation. So here we will put the question mark inside the closing quotation marks because it's all part of what Kevin said. So the sentence should be correctly punctuated like this. Everyone chuckled when Kevin quipped, comma, opening quotation marks. Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework? Question mark, closing quotation marks. As you can see, knowing how and where to use quotation marks can be a little tricky, and combining them with other punctuation marks takes a little bit of practice. But follow the rules that we've given you in this lesson, keep working at it, and soon I think you'll find you can handle these without making any errors. The punctuation marks we've looked at so far, the period, the question mark, the exclamation point, the comma, the semicolon, the colon, and quotation marks, all of these are by far the most common and important punctuation marks. There are a few other marks, though, that you ought to know how to use, even though as a writer you're better off using them relatively infrequently. So the punctuation marks that we're going to talk about in this lesson are ones that, generally speaking, you should avoid using a lot. Some writers do use these punctuation marks heavily, and usually that has a bad effect on style. Nonetheless, it's important to know about them, and we'll cover them briefly in this lesson. First, parentheses. Parentheses, like quotation marks, always have to be used in pairs. They're those little curved symbols, and parentheses are used to set off words or phrases that interrupt the meaning of a sentence. Now, we've already seen that pairs of commas can be used to set off words that interrupt the meaning of a sentence. Parentheses would mark a stronger interruption. The words within parentheses should truly be relatively unimportant or non-essential for the meaning of the sentence, and almost words that the reader could ignore and still capture the gist of the meaning of the sentence. So only use parentheses when you want to insert some additional words or an additional fact or idea that's relatively unimportant, but you just want to kind of toss it in to the sentence. Here are a couple of examples of how parentheses could be used. Everyone in Los Angeles, at least everyone I know, seems to be writing a screenplay. Here the point of the sentence is that everyone seems to be writing a screenplay, and the author just briefly interrupts himself or herself to say, well, everyone I know is included. Maybe it's not true of everyone. It's not a terribly important aside. It's a little idea that's just being kind of thrown in to add a little bit of color to the sentence. Not very important, and that's why putting it within parentheses is probably appropriate. Another example. John Lennon, 1942 to 1980, was a member of the Beatles, the most famous group in the history of pop music. Okay, the author wants to give you a basic piece of information about John Lennon, and while he's at it, he thinks, well, I might as well throw in John Lennon's birth and death dates. That might be useful to the reader. And rather than write a whole separate clause or sentence about that, I can easily insert those dates just by putting them within parentheses after the name John Lennon. And very often in encyclopedias or other reference works, you will see a parenthetical insertion used for just this purpose, to stick in an additional piece of information in a way that's unobtrusive and which the reader can ignore or look at if they're interested. So here's another good example of how parentheses can be used. Some people get into the habit of using parentheses a lot in their writing, and that's not too good because then sentences constantly feel like they're breaking apart and being interrupted. So avoid using parentheses a lot, but once in a while, for a statement that's truly an aside like this, you can use them. Another punctuation mark that's used for an abrupt break is a dash. Use a dash to indicate an abrupt break in the meaning of a sentence. A dash should feel like a more sudden and sharp break or interruption in the sentence than a comma, semicolon, or colon. In fact, when you use a dash, you should really only use it when there's a sudden change in the sentence, in its tone, its feeling, or in the meaning of the sentence. Here's an example. Someone had taken the file from the mayor's desk, but who? Notice how those last two words suddenly change the statement from being, simply a statement of a fact that someone had taken the file, to suddenly turning the sentence into a kind of a mystery. Who had taken it? There's almost a sudden air of danger or urgency added by those last couple of words. This is the kind of sentence that you might read in a mystery story where the author is introducing one of the important clues that will lead to the criminal. So in order to set up that tone of a sudden shift from a rather straightforward statement of fact into an atmosphere of mystery or danger, the dash has been used. And that's an example of how a dash indicates an abrupt break in the meaning of a sentence. Now, sometimes authors use pairs of dashes to surround interrupting material. As we've already seen, both pairs of commas and parentheses can be used to surround interrupting material. When you use dashes to do it, again, it feels a little bit more abrupt, and it's somewhat more informal in feeling. So if you were writing something rather informal, such as a story, for example, or a letter to a friend, using dashes can work perfectly well in this context. But for writing a paper for school, for example, or a report for work, you might prefer to use either commas or parentheses. But here's an example of how dashes could be used in pairs to set off material that interrupts the main flow of the sentence. Parker claimed, with some justification, that his enemies were being hypocritical. Here, the sentence mainly flows this way. Parker claimed that his enemies were being hypocritical. The author wants to throw in the additional fact that there was some justification for what Parker was claiming. And so he's done it as a parenthetical or interrupting phrase, and in this case he has chosen to use dashes to separate the interrupting phrase from the rest of the sentence. It's perfectly correct. You could either use commas or parentheses, and those would be equally correct in this particular sentence. As I say, the dashes would have a somewhat more informal feeling. If you do use dashes in this way, remember you have to have a dash both before and after the interrupting material. If you use it only in one place, you'll be making an error. The last punctuation mark we are going to tell you about is what's called ellipses. In a different program in this series, we talked about ellipsis meaning the omission of one or more words from a repeated phrase or clause. Ellipses, which is spelled ES at the end, is a little different. Ellipses also has to do with omissions, and the punctuation mark known as ellipses consists of 3 periods. Sometimes people refer to it as ... I have never figured out why in this particular context a period is referred to as a dot, but that's in fact what ellipses are, is 3 periods. If you're typing ellipses, you would space them out, so it would be period, space, period, space, period, space. Ellipses are used to indicate words omitted from a quotation or to signal the trailing off of the end of a sentence. Here are examples of each of these 2 uses of ellipses. First, as Lincoln once remarked, you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Now here we have a quotation enclosed within quotation marks, but Lincoln's actual words were more extensive than this. The actual quotation from Lincoln is, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. For whatever reason, the author of this sentence doesn't want to include all of Lincoln's words, but only some of them. So to indicate the words that have been left out, the author has put in ellipses, 3 periods in a row, which indicate to the reader, here are some words omitted that Lincoln actually said, but which I am choosing to leave out. It's a form of intellectual honesty, if you will. You are warning the reader, well, Lincoln said a little more than this. I'm leaving some of it out, so if you want to quote Lincoln later on, you'd better look up the whole quotation to get all the exact words. So from time to time, you may need to use ellipses for this purpose. For example, if you are writing a paper for school and you want to quote some other writer, you may not need or want to quote an entire sentence. And if that's the case, use ellipses to show where you're leaving words out. Now, occasionally writers also use ellipses, as I've said, to signal the trailing off of the end of a sentence, in which case they use ellipses as end punctuation and create a sentence that looks something like this. The house is dark. I wonder why. And we have the 3 periods at the end, indicating that the speaker or the writer of this sentence, that their thoughts are kind of trailing off. And I guess the idea is to create a sense of uncertainty or mystery. And the way I read the sentence, of course, was designed to indicate that kind of mood. Once in a great while, using ellipses to end a sentence this way could be appropriate. But again, some people get into the habit of using ellipses continually in their writing as a way of ending sentences. And it gives the feeling that they're a little too lazy to figure out exactly how they want to end the sentence. Do they want to end it with a period, a question mark, an exclamation point? What's the link between one sentence and the next? It creates somewhat of a vague feeling, almost as though there's fog creeping in between the sentences. So use this very sparingly, once in a while in an appropriate context where you really want to suggest that the sentence is drifting to an end rather than coming to a complete halt. You could use ellipses to end a sentence. But don't do it too often. It's not the greatest form of writing. So these last 3 forms of punctuation are used a little less often than any of the other punctuation marks that we've talked about in this program, and they have less hard and fast rules about how they're used. But sprinkled here and there occasionally in your writing, they can serve a perfectly good function, and so it's important to know how and when to use them. Parentheses, the dash, and ellipses. We've provided an exercise that will test your use of parentheses and the dash, not ellipses, because the unusual way in which ellipses are used to indicate omissions from quotations, it's kind of hard to create an exercise to test that since you'd have to omit words from quotation. So we focused on parentheses and dashes in this exercise. Try your hand at the exercise and come back and we'll look at the questions together. In this exercise, we've given you some sentences where either parentheses or dashes could be used, and we've even suggested at the end of the sentence which might be appropriate. And in fact, because these punctuation marks are used without very hard and fast rules, you could actually interchange them to some extent. So we've told you which one we think you might want to use in a particular sentence, and your job is just to figure out how and where to use them. Let's look at our first example. Because the following day, Wednesday, was the 1st of June, Loretta's rent payment was due. And we've suggested using parentheses in this sentence. Now, parentheses would be used to set off a word or phrase that interrupts the meaning of the sentence. Which word or phrase does that here? Well, in this case, the word Wednesday gives a little additional information. It tells you specifically what the following day was, and might make the story a little easier for someone to understand or to follow. But that would be appropriate to enclose in parentheses. So the best use of parentheses in this sentence would be, because the following day, open parentheses, Wednesday, end parentheses, was the 1st of June, Loretta's rent payment was due. Next example. Napoleon's exile to the island of Elba marked the end of his career, or so it seemed. And we've recommended that you insert a dash or dashes somewhere into the sentence. Now, a dash, remember, is used to signal an abrupt break in the meaning of the sentence. Is there an abrupt break anywhere here? Well, yes. The last 4 words of the sentence take a very different tack from the remaining part of the sentence. Up to that point in the sentence, we're being told that Napoleon's career was over. But the last 4 words tell us, something different is going to happen, or so it seemed. When we read those 4 words, we realize that the sentences that follow are going to tell us about how Napoleon actually started his career again after being exiled to Elba. So there is a sudden break in meaning there, and that's where we would insert the dash. So the sentence could now read, Napoleon's exile to the island of Elba marked the end of his career dash, or so it seemed. The dash alerts the reader, aha, a sudden unexpected change is happening. Next example. The Battle of Bull Run, known in the South as First Manassas, was the first major encounter of the Civil War. And we've suggested that you use parentheses somewhere in this sentence. Well, this is a good example of another way that parentheses can be used to give some additional information about a fact that's mentioned in the sentence, and to do it in a way that's not obtrusive, but which, if the reader finds it useful or helpful, then fine, the reader knows where that information appears. In this case, the words, known in the South as First Manassas, ought to be enclosed in parentheses. You can see why. The battle is mainly known as the Battle of Bull Run, but within a certain part of the United States, it has a different name. If this sentence is being read by someone who happens to be from Georgia, let's say, in school they might have learned the name First Manassas, and so having it in parentheses for them would help clarify for them exactly which battle is being described. Most readers, however, will probably ignore the parenthetical phrase or skim over it in their reading, and that's why putting it in parentheses is useful. It sets this particular information aside as not very important, but it's nice to have in case the reader wants it. So the sentence would then read, the Battle of Bull Run, open parentheses, known in the South as First Manassas, close parentheses, was the first major encounter of the Civil War. Next sentence. When we compare today's automobiles to those of a century ago, we can see that much has changed. In fact, practically everything has changed. And we want to see you insert a dash into this sentence. Now, where is there an abrupt or sudden break in the meaning of the sentence? Well, it comes between the word changed and the phrase in fact. The sentence there suddenly shifts from saying that a lot of things have changed to saying actually everything has changed. It's almost as though the speaker of the sentence or the writer of the sentence is interrupting his own thinking to say, much has changed? What am I saying? Everything has changed. It's like they're correcting themselves in midstream. So putting the dash there indicates the break in meaning, and the sentence would then read, when we compare today's automobiles to those of a century ago, we can see that much has changed, dash. In fact, practically everything has changed. Another good example of the use of the dash. And our last sentence. In a later section of the book, chapters 4 through 6, the author describes in detail the early struggles of the American labor movement. And you're asked to pick certain words and enclose them within parentheses. Which are the words that interrupt the main flow of the sentence, but give a little additional or extra information that might be helpful? In this case, the interrupting words are chapters 4 through 6, so we would enclose those in parentheses. Once again, the reader can ignore those words if he or she chooses, but in case the reader wants to look up that later section of the book, the chapter reference is there, and it makes it easy to find it. So the sentence would read, in a later section of the book, open parentheses, chapters 4 through 6, close parentheses, the author describes in detail the early struggles of the American labor movement. So one good way of using parentheses is to get a reference like that in. You can even use parentheses, for example, to enclose a page number within a paper that you might be writing for school. So if you're quoting a particular work, you can put the page number in parentheses to make it easy for the teacher to look up that quotation in the book if he or she wants to do so. And it does that in a rather unobtrusive way without taking away too much attention from the main flow of the sentence. A good use of parentheses. Earlier in this program, I suggested that punctuation marks could be thought of as being like traffic signs. They tell you where to slow down, where to come to a complete stop, and where to change direction. That's a good comparison, but here's another one. You could also think of punctuation marks as being like the symbols that composers use when they write music. Symbols such as rests, or the symbols that indicate an increased volume or decreased volume, speeding up or slowing down. The punctuation marks tell the reader exactly how to read the sentences and the paragraphs that you write. They tell the reader which points need greater emphasis, which ideas belong together, which ideas should be separated, and when there's an abrupt change in the meaning. If you use punctuation marks skillfully, they can make your writing much easier to understand and enable your readers to follow your thinking just as efficiently as a trained musician or a trained singer can follow the instructions given by the composer for performing a piece of music in a way that really embodies what the composer originally had in mind. So learn the proper ways of using punctuation marks, and you'll find that your writing will be much easier to understand and much more effective at getting across your meaning in a powerful way. I hope you've enjoyed watching this program, and I'll look for you in other programs in Video Aided Instruction's English Grammar Series. Thanks for watching.